As some of you may know, in addition to teaching at SUNY Brockport, I also work on issues related to human trafficking. I've been fortunate enough to work with both international and local anti trafficking organizations, and recently began collaborating with the Rochester Human Trafficking Intervention Court. This semester, I had a senior student join me to attend Human Trafficking Intervention Court. So, before we move on and begin our discussion of sexual identities, I wanted for you to hear from Brianna Middleton, a senior at Rockport, about her experiences learning about human trafficking and human trafficking intervention court.
Human trafficking is defined as the use of force, fraud, or coercion to obtain some type of labor or commercial sex act. Human trafficking is also commonly referred to as modern-day slavery. It is estimated that there are between 20 million and 40 million people trafficked into modern slavery each year. The U.S. Department of State estimates that between 14,500 and 17,500 people are trafficked into the United States alone. Human trafficking intervention courts are innovative problem-solving courts which aim to identify and assist survivors of human trafficking who otherwise would have been convicted with criminal charges pending against them. These kinds of intervention courts were created on the basis that most people arrested on the act of prostitution, for example, may have faced some kind of coercion in their past which led them here. Whether this be a boyfriend telling them to go out and make money by any means, or actually being someone who came from a foreign country and didn't see any other way to make money and make ends meet other than sex work. Instead of incarceration, victims can receive services suited to their individual development needs. For example, what I witnessed during the human trafficking intervention courts in Rochester was that a lot of these victims were connected to services that helped them either with drug abuse or mental abuse. We'll see that on the next slide. I also realized that these people were connected to a social worker who let herself be available to these victims at most hours of the day and were able to speak about their personal and court progress within the court system. Instead of incarceration, victims can receive services suited to their individual development needs. We also see that these courts serve to restore dignity and empowerment through the services they provide. During my visits at the Human Trafficking Court, I noticed a few demographic markers of the identified victims and those in positions of power in the courtroom. Those included gender, race, class, mental health, and substance abuse. In terms of gender, I noticed that none of the victims were identified as anything other than women. And of these women, majority of them were women of color. As for the persons that were a part of the court system, there was mostly women, and the men who were present seemed to be in positions of power, whether it being a security guard, a police officer, or a public defender. In addition to race, among the victims, we realized that the people who were in charge of the court systems also seemed to be overwhelmingly white. Class is another marker I realized, seeming to me that the victims were of lower class and were utilizing some form of public assistance, which is usually an indicator of poverty. Another thing I realized was that mental health was present among a lot of these victims. Most of them were connected to a psychiatric or in a group home that were helping them on some type of personal or emotional issue. The last marker that I realized was substance abuse. Many of the women in the human trafficking system were asked about their progress on using drugs or alcohol and if that was anything that they needed more assistance on. The Human Trafficking Intervention Court in Rochester is one of the most empathetic courtrooms I've ever set foot in. During my first visit, I watched the judge give a hug to someone graduating from the program in the middle of a pandemic. The recognition of abuse and exploitation as the reality for many of these victims is a critical defining piece to the design of a human trafficking intervention court. The shift from viewing the defendant as victims rather than a criminal is also pertinent to their treatment. This trauma-informed approach is extended to everyone within and outside of the court to take a more alert and sensitive approach. I believe that this approach is what really contributes to the success of this program and contributes to treating these people as humans and not as criminals for their acts.